My parents banned me from cars after my brother nearly died in a car crash. They don't know I'm a Tokyo street legend. My parents made exactly one rule after they pulled my older brother Ethan from the wreckage of his Subaru on Highway 101. No driving, no cars, not even sitting in the driver's seat of a parked vehicle until I turned 25. They'd already sold both family cars and switched to ride shares exclusively, and they made me delete every racing video game from my console after catching me watching dashcam footage of the Wangan Expressway at 2 in the morning. Dad couldn't even watch car commercials without his hands starting to shake. The problem was that I'd inherited whatever gene made Ethan obsessed with speed, that same inexplicable need to feel an engine respond to your inputs and push a machine to its absolute limits. And now I was stuck in suburban California, taking the bus to community college while my friends posted videos from track days and autocross events. Everything I wanted to do, everything I was apparently built for, had been locked away behind a rule born from trauma and fear. The worst part was visiting Ethan in the long-term care facility every weekend, watching him struggle through physical therapy to relearn how to walk after the crash shattered both his legs and fractured his spine in 3 places. He'd been street racing on a canyon road when he lost control, and the doctors said he was lucky to be alive. My parents said he was proof that cars were death machines, and anyone who got behind the wheel was playing Russian roulette with their life. I spent 6 months following their rule perfectly, taking buses and bumming rides and pretending I didn't care about cars anymore. But the craving never went away. It just got worse, like trying to ignore hunger by not thinking about food. I'd lie awake at night remembering the one time Ethan had let me drive his car in an empty parking lot before the crash, the way the steering wheel communicated every detail of the road surface, how the throttle response felt like a conversation between me and the machine. Everything changed when I started working part-time at a shipping company warehouse to save money for college, moving boxes and processing international freight manifests for minimum wage. My parents loved that I was being responsible and earning money doing something completely unrelated to vehicles. That's where I met Kenji Nakamura, a logistics coordinator who handled shipments between California and Japan. He'd noticed me studying Japanese during my lunch breaks and asked why I was learning the language. I told him the truth, that I was obsessed with Japanese car culture and wanted to understand the communities I watched in translated videos online. He laughed and said his nephew ran a small import shop in Shibuya that specialized in used performance parts, and if I was serious about learning, he could arrange a summer internship helping with inventory and translations. My parents didn't even hesitate when I asked about spending 3 months in Tokyo working at an auto parts warehouse. They saw it as cultural education and language immersion, a productive way to spend my summer that had nothing to do with actual driving. What they didn't know was that Kenji's nephew wasn't just running a parts shop. He was one of the most connected people in Tokyo's underground racing scene, and his shop was where street racers came to build their machines. I arrived in Tokyo in June with a suitcase full of clothes and a head full of theoretical knowledge about cars that I'd never actually applied. The shop was a narrow 3-story building wedged between a ramen restaurant and a convenience store in a part of Shibuya that tourists never saw. Kenji's nephew, a guy named Riku who looked about 30 and moved like he hadn't slept in days, took one look at me and asked in perfect English if I could actually drive or just talk about it. I admitted I'd only driven once, in a parking lot, and he laughed so hard he had to sit down. For the first 2 weeks, I just did inventory and helped customers, learning the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical understanding. I could identify every part, explain what it did, calculate the performance gains, but I'd never actually installed anything or felt how a car responded to modifications. Riku would test me constantly, holding up random components and asking what they were for, where they went, what other parts you'd need to make them work properly. I got about 90% right, and he seemed impressed despite his constant skepticism. The shop closed at 8 every evening, but the real work started at 9 when the street racers showed up. They'd roll in with cars that looked completely stock on the outside, but had tens of thousands of dollars in modifications hidden underneath. Riku would help them diagnose problems, suggest upgrades, and occasionally go out with them to test builds on the expressway. I watched from the shop, organizing parts and pretending I wasn't dying to be out there with them. On my 3rd Friday night, a guy named Daiki brought in a heavily modified Nissan Skyline that was misfiring during boost. Riku was dealing with another customer, so he told me to hook it up to the diagnostic computer and start pulling codes. I found the problem in about 10 minutes, a failing ignition coil that was breaking down under the stress of increased boost pressure. Daiki asked how old I was and seemed genuinely surprised when I said 18. He asked if I'd ever actually worked on cars before, and I admitted this was my first hands-on experience despite years of studying. He pulled Riku aside, and they had a conversation in rapid Japanese that I couldn't quite follow. Then Daiki looked at me and asked in English if I wanted to see what his car could do once we fixed it. We replaced the coil, and I rode in the passenger seat as Daiki took the Skyline out onto the Shudo Expressway after midnight, when traffic was light. He went through the gears and hit boost, and the acceleration pressed me back into the seat with a force I'd only experienced on roller coasters. The way the car handled, the precision of the steering, the sound of the turbos spooling up, It was everything I'd imagined multiplied by 1,000. We got off the expressway and drove through surface streets back to the shop, and I couldn't stop grinning despite trying to play it cool. Daiki told Riku I had good instincts and asked if I'd be interested in learning more practical skills beyond just parts identification. That's how I started actually working on cars instead of just reading about them. Riku would have me assist with installations, teaching me the difference between textbook torque specs and real-world adjustments. I learned how to diagnose problems by sound and feel, how to test drive cars, and interpret what the vehicle was telling you through steering feedback and throttle response. Within a month, I could rebuild a transmission and tune a fuel map, skills that usually took years to develop. I was living in a tiny apartment above a convenience store that Riku helped me find, and I'd spend every evening at the shop until 2 or 3 in the morning, then sleep for a few hours before starting again. My parents would video call once a week, and I'd show them the parts warehouse during business hours, talking about cultural experiences and language practice, while carefully avoiding any mention of what happened after the shop closed. The racing community started to recognize me as Riku's American apprentice, this kid who could diagnose problems faster than mechanics with decades of experience, but had never actually raced. They'd joke about it constantly, calling me the professor or the engineer, someone who understood the theory perfectly, but had no practical application. It didn't bother me because I knew they were right. I'd never raced, never pushed a car to its limits in a competitive situation, never felt what it was like to have someone challenging you at 140 kilometers per hour through traffic. That changed on a Wednesday night in August, when Riku needed someone to move a customer's car from the shop to a parking garage across town. The customer was a regular named Haru, who ran a small crew of racers and had dropped off his Toyota Supra for a turbo upgrade. The job was supposed to be simple, just drive it 15 minutes across Shibuya and park it where he'd pick it up the next day. But when I got behind the wheel, something clicked in a way that watching and learning never had. The Supra had a sequential transmission and enough power to break the rear wheels loose in third gear. Just driving it normally through traffic, I could feel the potential, the way it wanted to go faster, how it responded to the smallest steering inputs. I took a slightly longer route than necessary, finding empty stretches of road where I could accelerate harder and feel how the car handled under power. By the time I parked it at the garage, I understood something I'd never fully grasped from the passenger seat. This wasn't just about speed or mechanical knowledge. It was about the conversation between driver and machine, the way you had to listen and respond and push back, a dance that required instinct as much as skill. Haru was waiting at the garage when I arrived, and he knew immediately that I'd done more than just drive his car across town in traffic. He asked if I'd been racing it, and I said no, just testing it, making sure the new turbo was working properly. He studied me for a long moment, then asked if I'd ever actually raced before. I admitted I hadn't, and he laughed and said that was obvious from how carefully I'd driven his very expensive car. He offered to let me come out the next night and watch his crew run some races on the Bayshore route, the infamous stretch of expressway where Tokyo's fastest racers had been testing themselves for decades. I asked Riku if it was okay, and he just shrugged and said I'd learn more in one night of watching races than in a month of working on cars in the shop. The Bayshore route at 2 in the morning was unlike anything I'd experienced. The expressway was nearly empty, except for occasional trucks, and when Haru's crew rolled up in a convoy of modified cars, I could feel the tension and excitement radiating off everyone. They were racing from one rest stop to another, about 15 kilometers of mostly straight road where terminal velocity mattered more than cornering skill. I watched from a chase car as they launched, the turbocharged engines screaming as they accelerated past 200 kilometers per hour. The whole race was over in under 4 minutes, with Haru's Supra crossing the finish point just ahead of a heavily modified Mazda RX-7. Back at the rest stop, everyone was analyzing what happened, discussing gear ratios and boost pressure, and where they gained or lost time. One of Haru's crew members, a woman named Yuki, who drove a Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution, asked me what I thought of the race. I walked her through everything I'd observed, pointing out where the Mazda had better acceleration off the line, but lost ground in the higher speed ranges. How Haru had used the Supra's power advantage to pull ahead once they were both above 180. She listened carefully, then asked if I could drive like I talked. I said honestly I didn't know, that I'd never had the chance to find out. She tossed me her keys and told me to take her car for a run, just me on the empty expressway to see what I could do. Her Lancer had an aggressive clutch and a short-throw shifter that required precision, and the all-wheel drive system meant it handled completely differently from the rear-wheel drive cars I'd been studying. I took it through the gears carefully, feeling how it responded, where the power came on, how the weight transferred under acceleration and braking. By the third run, I was pushing harder, taking it up to 170 and feeling how stable it stayed at speeds that should have been terrifying. When I came back to the rest stop, Yuki asked what I thought of her setup, and I suggested 3 specific modifications that would address the turbo lag I'd felt in the mid-range. She pulled out her phone and showed me her modification list, and 2 of my 3 suggestions were already planned for the next month. Haru asked if I wanted to try racing, actual competition against another car instead of just solo runs. Every instinct told me to say no, that this was exactly what my parents had forbidden, that getting involved in street racing was betraying their trust and risking everything they feared. But standing there on the Bayshore route with the Tokyo skyline glowing in the distance and these people who'd accepted me into their community, I couldn't make myself walk away. I said yes, and Haru set up a race between me and Yuki's Lancer and a newer member of their crew driving a Nissan Silvia. The race was the same 15-kilometer stretch, and I'd be starting from a disadvantage because the Lancer had less peak power than the Silvia. When the flag dropped and we launched, I felt everything I'd learned crystallize into pure instinct. I kept the revs in the optimal power band, shifted at exactly the right points, and used the all-wheel drive traction to stay ahead through the first few kilometers. The Silvia was faster in a straight line, but I could brake later and accelerate earlier, and by the time we hit the finish point, I was 3 car lengths ahead. The feeling of winning that first race was unlike anything I'd experienced, a combination of adrenaline and accomplishment and pure joy that made every cautious decision I'd made in my life feel like wasted time. Back at the rest stop, Haru's whole crew was talking about my driving, surprised that someone who'd never raced before could be that smooth and consistent. Yuki said I drove like someone with years of experience, and I explained that I'd spent those years studying instead of practicing, learning the theory so thoroughly that applying it felt natural once I finally had the chance. Haru asked if I wanted to race again next week, and I agreed before really thinking about the implications of what I was committing to. Over the next month, I raced almost every night, learning the different routes and styles that define Tokyo's street racing culture. The Bayshore route for straight-line speed, the Wangan Expressway for sustained high-velocity runs, the mountain passes outside the city for technical driving that required precision and bravery. I was getting better rapidly, winning more races than I lost, and people started to recognize me as that American kid who drove like he'd been doing this his whole life. Riku pulled me aside one night and asked if I understood how dangerous this was, not just the physical risk, but the legal consequences if I got caught. I said I understood, but I couldn't stop now that I'd finally found what I was supposed to be doing. He didn't try to talk me out of it, just made me promise to be smart and avoid unnecessary risks. The racing community has a hierarchy, with the fastest and most respected drivers occupying the top tier. They're the ones who'd been racing for decades, who knew every road and every technique, whose cars represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in modifications and countless hours of tuning. I was nowhere near that level yet, still proving myself in the lower ranks, but I was moving up faster than anyone expected, and that started to attract attention I wasn't ready for. A crew from Yokohama challenged Haru's group to a series of races, putting up significant money and reputation. Haru's usual drivers were all committed, but he needed one more person for the team race format they'd agreed to. He asked if I was ready to race at that level, against drivers who'd been doing this since before I was born, and I said yes, even though I was terrified. The race was scheduled for a Saturday night in September, and the format was brutal. 5 drivers per team, racing simultaneously on different routes across the city, with the team's total time determining the winner. I'd be running the C1 loop, the circular expressway that required maintaining high speeds through constant curves and elevation changes. It was considered one of the most technically demanding routes, and Haru was trusting me with it despite my limited experience. I spent the week before the race studying the C1 loop obsessively, riding along with other drivers and memorizing every curve, every merge point, every place where the road surface changed. Yuki let me practice in her Lancer for hours, running the route dozens of times until I could navigate it perfectly, even when exhausted. The night of the race, I was so nervous I could barely eat, but once I was behind the wheel waiting for the start signal, everything else fell away. The race was chaos in the best possible way, with all 5 drivers from each team launching simultaneously and spreading out across Tokyo. I pushed the Lancer harder than I'd ever pushed any car, taking corners at speeds that felt impossible, threading through the minimal traffic with inches to spare. The C1 loop took me just under 12 minutes, and when I got back to the meeting point, I was the second driver to arrive, just behind one of Haru's veterans. We won by a combined margin of 43 seconds, and the Yokohama crew was stunned that Haru had brought in a complete unknown who'd posted one of the fastest C1 times of the night. After that race, my reputation changed completely. People started calling me Ghost, because I'd appeared out of nowhere and driven like I'd been racing in Tokyo my entire life. Haru offered to sponsor me properly, providing cars and parts and entry fees for bigger races if I wanted to pursue this seriously. I said yes, even though I knew it meant lying to my parents more extensively and taking risks that went far beyond what they'd forbidden. I convinced myself I was being careful, racing only on routes I knew well, maintaining the cars meticulously, always having an escape plan if police showed up. But deep down, I knew I was doing exactly what had nearly killed Ethan, just in a different country where my parents couldn't see. My summer internship was supposed to end in late September, but I convinced my parents to let me stay through the fall semester, claiming the shop wanted to keep me on and I could take online classes. They agreed reluctantly, and I used the extra time to establish myself further in the racing scene. By November, I was racing 3 or 4 times a week, winning enough to cover my expenses and start building my own car with Riku's help. We found a Nissan 180SX that had been wrecked in the rear and rebuilt it from the ground up, installing a built engine with a larger turbo and suspension components that cost more than the car itself. Working on my own car was different from working on customers' vehicles. Every part I installed, every adjustment I made, it all directly affected how the car would perform when I drove it. Riku taught me how to tune the engine management system, adjusting fuel and timing maps to extract maximum power while maintaining reliability. By December, the 180SX was ready to race, and taking it out for the first time felt like stepping into a machine that was built specifically for how I drove. Everything responded exactly as I expected, because I'd designed it that way, choosing gear ratios and suspension settings that matched my style perfectly. I entered a major race series that ran through the winter, a points-based championship across multiple routes with the best drivers in the Kanto region. The competition was intense, with drivers who'd been racing for 20 years going against newer racers like me who brought fresh approaches and fearlessness that came from not fully understanding how dangerous this was. I finished third in the first race, second in the next two, and won the fourth race outright, beating a driver named Takeshi who'd won the championship for the past 3 years. That victory changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just some promising newcomer. I was a legitimate threat to the established order, someone who could actually win the championship if I stayed consistent. The racing community started treating me differently, with more respect, but also more scrutiny. People wanted to know where I'd learned to drive, who'd trained me, why an American teenager was suddenly dominating races against Japan's best street racers. The attention got back to Kenji in California, who called me in January asking what exactly I'd been doing in Tokyo beyond working at his nephew's shop. I admitted everything: the racing, the wins, the car I'd built, the championship series I was leading. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked if my parents knew. I said no. They thought I was just working at an auto parts shop and taking online classes. He told me I was playing with fire, and that secrets this big always found a way to come out. But he didn't tell me to stop. He just made me promise to be more careful, and to think about what I'd do when the summer ended, and I had to return to California. The championship came down to the final race in March, with me and Takeshi separated by just 11 points. The route was a combination run, starting on the Wangan, cutting through surface streets in central Tokyo, then finishing on a mountain pass outside the city. It would test everything: straight-line speed, technical driving, and the ability to adapt to different conditions rapidly. The night of the final race, I stood at the starting line with my 180SX, surrounded by the best drivers in Tokyo, and I felt completely calm, despite knowing this race would define everything I'd built over the past 9 months. When the flag dropped, I drove the race of my life, staying ahead of Takeshi through the Wangan section, maintaining my lead through the chaotic surface streets, and then pushing hard through the mountain pass despite rain starting to fall halfway through. I crossed the finish line first, beating Takeshi by 6 seconds, and winning the championship at 18 years old, after less than a year of actual racing experience. The celebration afterward was massive, with hundreds of people from the racing community coming out to acknowledge what I'd accomplished. Haru gave a speech about natural talent and dedication. Yuki presented me with a custom trophy, and Riku just shook his head and said he'd known from day one I was something special, even though I'd never driven before arriving in Tokyo. But standing there accepting congratulations and taking photos with my championship car, I felt a growing sense of dread about what would happen when my parents inevitably found out. I'd built this entire life in Tokyo, become someone completely different from the obedient son who'd followed their rules back in California. How was I supposed to go back to taking the bus and pretending I didn't care about cars, now that I'd proven I was one of the best in the world at this? The decision got made for me 2 days later when a popular automotive YouTuber posted a video about the championship race, featuring extensive footage of me driving and interviewing other racers about Ghost, the American teenager who'd come to Tokyo and conquered the street racing scene in under a year. The video went viral, getting millions of views in the first week, and someone from my hometown recognized me and posted about it on social media. My phone exploded with messages from people I'd gone to high school with, asking if it was really me in the videos racing through Tokyo. My parents called while I was at the shop helping Riku with a customer's car, and I knew from my mom's voice that they'd seen everything. She asked if I was the person in those racing videos, and I couldn't lie anymore. I said yes, that I'd been street racing in Tokyo for the past 9 months, that I'd won the championship, and was being recruited by professional teams. The silence on the other end of the call lasted so long I thought they'd hung up. Then my dad's voice came through, cold and controlled in a way that was worse than yelling. He said I'd betrayed their trust in the most fundamental way possible, that I'd used their permission to go to Tokyo as cover for doing the exact thing they'd forbidden after Ethan's crash. He said I had 1 week to pack my things and come home, and when I got there, we'd discuss the consequences of my choices. I tried to explain that what I'd been doing was different from Ethan's reckless street racing on unfamiliar canyon roads, that I'd been training with professionals, learning proper techniques, racing on routes I knew intimately with safety measures in place. But my mom cut me off and said there was no safe version of illegal street racing, that I could have killed myself or someone else, and I'd thrown away their trust for an adrenaline addiction. She said Ethan was still in physical therapy learning to walk properly, and I'd decided his suffering meant nothing compared to my desire to drive fast. That accusation hit harder than anything else because part of me knew it was true. I justified my actions by telling myself I was being careful, but fundamentally I'd chosen my own wants over their legitimate fears. The call ended with my dad saying he'd already booked my flight home for the following Monday, and I needed to be on it, or I'd be completely on my own with no family support. After I hung up, I just sat on the shop floor trying to process that my entire life in Tokyo was ending in 5 days. Riku found me there an hour later and asked what happened, and I explained that my parents had discovered everything and were forcing me to come home. He asked what I wanted to do, and honestly, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to stay in Tokyo, continue racing, pursue the professional opportunities that were starting to appear. But another part knew I couldn't completely cut off my family, especially when they were still dealing with Ethan's recovery. The racing community rallied around me once word got out, with drivers offering to help me stay in Japan if I wanted, providing places to live and work if I chose to make racing my career. Haru said I had more natural talent than anyone he'd seen in 30 years of racing, and walking away now would be wasting a gift that most people would kill to have. Takeshi, the driver I'd beaten for the championship, told me that racing at my level required absolute commitment, and if I went back to California with my parents' restrictions, I'd never reach my full potential. I spent the next 3 days agonizing over the decision, racing each night like it might be my last time, trying to memorize every sensation and experience before it all ended. On my final night in Tokyo, Yuki organized a farewell run on the Bayshore route with everyone I'd raced with over the past 9 months. We did a parade lap together, dozens of modified cars rolling through the expressway at legal speeds, headlights illuminating the route where I'd proven myself. Back at the rest stop afterward, people shared stories about races I'd won, times I'd helped them with their cars, moments when I'd shown them techniques they'd never considered. Riku pulled me aside before I left and handed me an envelope containing detailed documentation of everything I'd learned and accomplished in Tokyo. He said my parents might never understand why racing mattered to me, but at least I'd have proof that I hadn't wasted the time or taken foolish risks. The flight home was terrible, 14 hours of replaying conversations and wondering if I'd made the right choice by agreeing to come back. When I landed in San Francisco, my parents were waiting at arrivals, and their expressions were a mix of anger, disappointment, and fear. We drove home in silence, and I noticed they'd bought a car again, a basic sedan that my mom drove while my dad sat in the passenger seat watching me like I might somehow hijack the vehicle. At home, they'd converted my bedroom into a home office, boxing up my stuff and putting it in the garage. My dad explained this was temporary, that I'd be staying with my aunt across town until we figured out what came next. They'd withdrawn their financial support for college, and I'd need to either get a full-time job or take out loans if I wanted to continue my education. The punishment felt harsh, but not unexpected, given how thoroughly I'd violated their trust. The first few weeks back were miserable. I got a job at a warehouse moving boxes, the same kind of mindless physical labor that felt like the opposite of the precision and skill racing required. I'd come home exhausted to my aunt's house, eat dinner, and lie in bed watching videos of Tokyo's racing scene, seeing people I knew competing in races I should have been running. My aunt noticed I was struggling and asked what was going on, so I told her the whole story. She listened without judgment, then asked if I'd considered that maybe both things could be true, that my parents' fear was valid given what happened to Ethan, and that my talent and passion for racing was also legitimate and shouldn't be completely suppressed. She suggested family therapy, a neutral space where we could talk through this without the immediate emotional intensity that had characterized every conversation since I'd returned. I approached my parents with the idea, and they agreed reluctantly, saying they'd try anything if it meant preventing me from sneaking off to race again. Our first session was brutal, with my parents describing their trauma from Ethan's crash and their terror when they discovered I'd been racing. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Reyes, let them speak without interruption, then asked me to share my perspective. I tried to explain what racing meant to me, how it wasn't about recklessness or adrenaline addiction, but about finding something I was naturally gifted at and pursuing it with discipline and dedication. I showed them videos of my races, pointing out the precision and control, the safety measures, the professional approach that separated organized street racing from the kind of reckless canyon racing that had nearly killed Ethan. My parents watched the footage, and I could see their perception shifting slightly as they realized this wasn't just their kid acting out. This was someone who'd achieved genuine mastery in an incredibly competitive field. Over several sessions, we slowly started to bridge the gap between their fears and my aspirations. Dr. Reyes helped them understand that completely forbidding something I was passionate about hadn't prevented me from pursuing it, just forced me to lie and hide, which was arguably more dangerous. She suggested compromise, legal track racing instead of street racing, proper training at racing schools, transparency about what I was doing instead of secrecy. My parents struggled with this, arguing that any form of racing was too risky. But Dr. Reyes pointed out that I was 18 now, legally an adult, and would make my own choices eventually whether they approved or not. The question was whether they wanted to be part of that journey or completely cut out of it. That perspective seemed to affect my dad particularly, making him realize that total prohibition might cost him his relationship with me entirely. During one session in May, I brought Riku into the conversation via video call from Tokyo. He explained to my parents how seriously the racing community took safety, how experienced drivers mentored newer ones, how the technical knowledge required was immense and demanded respect for the machinery and the risks involved. He told them about my work ethic, how I'd spent months learning theory before ever racing, how I approached every race with careful preparation and risk assessment. My mom asked him directly if he thought street racing was safe, and he said honestly no. Nothing involving vehicles at high speeds was completely safe. But he added that I'd shown more maturity and caution than many drivers twice my age, and my talent was rare enough that completely preventing me from pursuing it felt wrong. After that session, my parents asked to visit Ethan with me, the first time we'd all gone together since I'd returned from Tokyo. Ethan was walking with a cane now, his progress remarkable given how severe his injuries had been. When we were alone, I told him about Tokyo, about becoming a championship racer, about how our parents had reacted. He listened to everything, then said something I hadn't expected. He told me he'd been reckless when he crashed, racing someone he didn't know on a road he'd never driven, in a car that wasn't properly maintained. He'd been showing off more than actually racing. What I'd done in Tokyo sounded completely different, professional and measured. He said he didn't want his mistakes to prevent me from pursuing something I was genuinely talented at, and he'd talk to our parents about loosening their restrictions if I promised to do this the right way. That conversation shifted something fundamental in my family's dynamic. With Ethan's support, my parents agreed to let me pursue racing under specific conditions. I could attend a professional racing school to get proper training, compete in legal track events with safety regulations, and work toward getting a competition license. Street racing was still absolutely forbidden, and any violation would result in permanent consequences. I accepted their terms, knowing this was as close to a blessing as I'd get. Over the summer, I attended a performance driving school in Northern California, learning advanced techniques from professional instructors in a controlled environment. It felt strange at first, racing on closed tracks with safety barriers and flag marshals, so different from the wild freedom of Tokyo's streets. But I had to admit the instruction was valuable, teaching me things I'd missed learning on my own. I competed in my first legal race series in August, running a spec series where all the cars were identical and driver skill determined the outcome. I won 3 of the first 5 races, and racing teams started approaching me about development programs and potential sponsorships. By September, I'd received offers from 2 professional racing teams, including one that competed in international endurance racing. My parents attended one of my races in October, standing in the paddock looking uncomfortable but present. When I won that race, beating drivers with years more experience, I saw my dad's expression change from worried to something closer to proud. After the podium ceremony, he pulled me aside and said he was starting to understand why this mattered so much to me, that watching me race properly had shown him I was treating this as a serious pursuit rather than a death wish. My mom took longer to come around, still flinching at every race video and insisting I text her immediately after each event to confirm I was okay. But gradually, she stopped trying to talk me out of racing and started asking about my goals and progress instead. In November, I got a call from a Japanese racing team that competed in the Super GT series, one of Asia's premier racing championships. They'd seen my performances and wanted to know if I'd be interested in their junior development program, which would mean moving back to Japan and training with professional drivers while competing in lower formulas. The offer was incredible, a legitimate path to becoming a professional racing driver, but it would mean leaving California again and asking my parents to trust me in Tokyo after everything that had happened. I brought the offer to my parents during one of our family dinners, explaining what the program entailed and what it could mean for my future. They listened carefully, asking detailed questions about safety protocols, supervision, housing arrangements, everything they needed to know to feel comfortable with their son moving across the world to race cars for a living. My dad asked what the alternative was if I turned down the offer, and I admitted I'd probably stay in California, race locally, maybe go to college for mechanical engineering. My mom asked which option would make me happier, and I told her the truth. Racing professionally in Japan was what I wanted more than anything, but not if it meant completely destroying my relationship with them. They asked for a week to think about it, and I waited anxiously while they processed the decision. During that week, Ethan called me several times, talking through his own regrets about racing recklessly and encouraging me to pursue this opportunity the right way. He said watching me succeed at something he'd failed at didn't make him jealous. It made him hopeful that talent and passion could lead to something positive instead of tragedy. His support meant everything, giving me permission to chase this dream without guilt about his injuries. My parents called me over for dinner the following Sunday, and from their expressions, I couldn't tell what they'd decided. We sat down, and my dad explained they'd spent the week researching the team, the program, the safety record of professional motorsports in Japan. They'd spoken with Ethan extensively, with Dr. Reyes, and with each other about what felt right despite their fears. Then my mom said something I hadn't expected. She told me they'd realized they couldn't protect me from everything by forbidding things, that trying to control my choices had only created distance and deception. She said if I wanted to pursue professional racing, they'd support me, but with conditions: regular communication, transparency about any accidents or close calls, and a promise that I'd walk away if I ever felt I was taking unnecessary risks just to win. I agreed to everything immediately, signing a literal written agreement my dad had prepared that outlined expectations and consequences. In January, I moved back to Tokyo with my parents' blessing, joining the racing team's development program. The transition from street racing to professional motorsports was harder than I'd expected. The cars were faster and more complex, the competition was intense, and the pressure of representing a major racing team added stress I'd never experienced in underground racing. But Riku was still there, now working as a consultant for the team, helping me adapt to professional racing while maintaining the instincts I'd developed on Tokyo's streets. I competed in my first professional race series that spring, running Japanese Formula 4 against drivers who'd been training since childhood. I qualified mid-pack for the first race, finished 7th, and immediately started analyzing everything I'd done wrong. The team's engineers helped me understand how professional data analysis could improve my driving, showing me telemetry and video that revealed small mistakes costing me significant time. I absorbed everything like I had when first learning about cars, studying data and video for hours, working with the team to optimize every aspect of my performance. By the mid-season, I was consistently finishing in the top 5, and by the end of the year, I'd won 3 races and finished 4th in the championship. The team offered me a contract extension and a promotion to a faster series, seeing potential for me to eventually race in Super GT if I continued progressing. My parents flew to Japan in November to watch me race at Suzuka Circuit, one of the world's most famous racing tracks. Seeing them in the paddock, wearing team shirts and watching me prepare for qualifying felt surreal, given where we'd been 2 years earlier. After I qualified 3rd and finished 2nd in the race, they came to congratulate me, and my mom actually seemed excited rather than terrified. My dad said watching me race professionally, with safety equipment and medical staff and proper preparation, was completely different from imagining me street racing through Tokyo at midnight. He admitted he was starting to enjoy following my career, learning about motorsports, and bragging about his son, the professional racing driver. That night, we had dinner together in Tokyo, and my mom asked about my goals for the future. I told her honestly that I wanted to race in Super GT, potentially move to international series like the World Endurance Championship, and ultimately prove I could compete at the highest levels of motorsports. She listened carefully, then said she'd support whatever I chose, as long as I remembered the promises I'd made about safety and communication. Ethan video called during dessert, joining our celebration from California, where he was finishing his degree and working as a driving instructor, teaching new drivers the fundamentals in a controlled environment. He joked that one day he'd be known as the brother of a famous racing driver, and I told him he'd always be the one who inspired me to pursue this, even if his path had been difficult. Looking back now at everything that happened, from sneaking off to Tokyo for what my parents thought was a parts warehouse internship to becoming a professional racing driver with their support, I understand how unlikely this journey was. Most people don't get second chances after betraying their family's trust so completely, but my parents chose to evolve their perspective rather than rigidly maintain a rule born from trauma, and that choice saved our relationship while allowing me to pursue my dreams. The street racing scene in Tokyo still knows me as Ghost, the American kid who appeared out of nowhere and won a championship before disappearing into professional motorsports. I occasionally visit the old spots with Riku, catching up with drivers I raced against, some of whom have also moved into legitimate racing, while others still prefer the underground scene. They respect that I took a different path, and I respect that they're still doing what they love, even if it's outside the law. Last month, I competed in my first Super GT race, driving a factory-backed Honda NSX GT alongside a veteran Japanese driver. We finished 6th, and my parents watched from the team's hospitality suite, finally comfortable with their son racing cars for a living. The broadcast mentioned my background, how I'd gone from community college student to championship street racer to professional driver in just 3 years, and my phone exploded with messages from people back home who'd known me before Tokyo. My brother sent a text saying he was proud of me for turning our family's tragedy into something positive, for proving that passion and talent could overcome fear and restriction. He said watching my success had helped him make peace with his own past, accepting that his crash had been a turning point rather than just a tragedy. My parents' rule after Ethan's crash had been meant to protect me, but it had actually taught me something more valuable, that some callings are so fundamental to who you are that you'll find a way to pursue them regardless of obstacles. The key is doing it with integrity, transparency, and respect for the legitimate concerns of people who love you. I'm grateful they eventually understood that, and I'm grateful I found a way to honor both their fears and my dreams. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.